Order, order. Welcome to this afternoon's session of the Business and Trade Committee for our first oral evidence hearing on the manufacturing of batteries and the automotive sector in the UK. We have two panels today. In our first panel, I'm delighted to welcome Jeff Townsend, who's the founder of the Critical Minerals Association, Simon Moores, who's the Chief Executive of the Benchmark Mineral Intelligence Group, Jeremy Rathall, who is the founder and Chief Executive of Cornish Lithium, and Paul Lusty, who's the Director of the UK Critical Minerals Intelligence Centre. Thank you to all of you for coming in today. So my first question to kick us off is going to come to you, Simon, in the first instance, and then I'll open it up to others. Simon, in your evidence to us, you were quite punchy. And you said the UK is a bystander in the global battery arms race and that there's a land grab for critical minerals to fuel it. Are we already too far behind, or can we catch up?
We can catch up, most definitely. We are very far behind. This kind of global battery arms race, if you like, this build-out of lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles and for energy storage began in earnest 2015, really, and it really kind of then took off in, let's say, outside of China and Japan and Korea in 2018. And then the US has really got its act together with the Inflation Reduction Act. So we're seeing the US really push ahead with battery plants and the supply chains to fuel them. The UK at the moment doesn't have a strategy, doesn't have a runner in this race. Can talk about electric vehicles, can talk about being involved in energy storage and solar and wind. But unless you're making batteries here, unless you've got the chemical plants to fuel those batteries, the midstream of this supply chain, you're not involved in the industry. You're not involved in this energy storage revolution. So in summary, the UK acting now is for 2030 and beyond. The UK, as providing the government gets a strategy together, helps with the money to attract players here, 2030 and beyond, we're good. Up until that point, it's going to take that long to build the supply chain.
And by a kind of runner in the race, you mean the whole supply chain, not just a factory that puts things together, right?
Yeah, I think you need joined up thinking here. Yeah, I think the supply chain is now kind of at the top of the agenda, no matter what industry you're in, I guess, with government involved. But I think when you build a battery plant, a gigafactory, it takes the equivalent of one mine's worth of lithium, nickel, cobalt, graphite, manganese. If you don't have these 5 core critical minerals, you can't make a lithium-ion battery. So it's not necessarily just building the mines here. Certainly we need mining knowledge and capacity within the UK, but it's making sure that when you build a gigafactory, you have the critical mineral supply deals, the contracts, the partners in place to see that the lithium ion in the ground go all the way through to that battery plant. And that's really the crux of this global battery arms race. It's not just about making cells, it's about the whole supply chain.
Thank you. And Jeremy, we're always quite interested in this committee about the impact of American subsidies in the Inflation Reduction Act and other initiatives being put forward in America. Now, obviously, you can't just take the lithium in Cornwall and move it to America and deal with it there, so it doesn't affect your industry in quite the same way. But what are you seeing are the implications of subsidied intervention from the Americans and elsewhere on your ability to mine lithium in Cornwall?
I think that the implications of the Inflation Reduction Act and those subsidies are that they will attract capital to the US and to Canada rather than that capital coming here. It's far more advantageous to build a lithium supply chain in the US when some of the capital is put up by the government. So I think obviously geology's fixed, we can't transport it, but it's not so much about the ability, it's more about the capital to do it. The capital is far more incented to go into the US.
Because the business case tends to be stronger for their return on investments or their taxes or access to low-cost finance and things.
Absolutely.
And Jeff, to come to you, the government said to us that it's not feasible nor desirable to onshore all elements of the supply chain, which I think probably makes sense. But what should we be doing in the UK that we're not doing right now?
Really good question. No, we can't do everything. So the geology determines what we can do in the upstream. And so we do have projects like Cornish Lithium, Jeremy, that we absolutely need to get off the ground, because if you want strategic supply, that's where it is. It's in your country. We need to win that midstream race, and we are seeing a regionalisation of that midstream competitiveness. So yes, we should do more closer to the mines, wherever that may be, because it's important. It shortens supply chains and decreases carbon footprints. But as you get further up, closer to the downstream, or further down towards the downstream, I should say, we need to see more of that midstream in the UK. So the likes of Green Lithium and Tees Valley Lithium and other lithium producers here, but also other midstream across the board, whatever critical mineral space it is. That's something that we are not doing enough of yet. And going back to what Simon said, and on IRA, capital and government investment, de-risking this is absolutely key. And there's a number of ways they can do that. But if I am a producer of a refinery and I can do it in the UK or I can do it in the EU, but the EU is going to give me 20% of my OPEX, where do you think I'm going to place myself?
Now, we've talked about the midstream a little bit here and the kind of refining and processing that needs to be done. I mean, the UK has quite a lot of strength and history in the kind of chemicals industry. Why are we not making more of that at the moment? Is it just the same case around investment?
So traditional economic models don't work in this. So this is a brand new industrial revolution. You can't expect to build the downstream and have the midstream and the upstream happen. You can't build the upstream and expect the downstream to happen. You have to build all of it all at once. Now, it's very easy to go and talk about gigafactories. They're easy to sell, they're easy to explain. It's very hard to start talking about chemically difficult, often in places where there are lower incomes, and say this is what we absolutely need, and it's absolutely imperative we have this in the UK as a means of developing the entirety of the supply chain. How do you get an entire supply chain that could be 3,000 stages long, spread across the world, into a 30-second soundbite? It's impossible. So we absolutely do have a great chemical sector. We should be using that more. We have good industrial sites. We have free ports. We could be doing more there. Ultimately, until we have energy prices that compete with the EU on this regional competitiveness, we are always going to be at a disadvantage.
Paul Lusty, welcome back to the committee. You gave evidence to us before about the government's critical minerals strategy. Remind us, in terms of the kind of critical minerals that we need to make batteries, I think I'm right in saying we wouldn't have everything that we need in the UK, so we're going to have to do partnerships with Australia, Canada, presumably the European Union. But what are our strengths in the UK? What do we have here domestically that we should be making the most of? And what are the things where we're going to have to rely on partners?
You're absolutely right. We do have elements of what you might describe as an emerging lithium-ion value chain in the UK. There's ongoing exploration, particularly in southwest England, primarily focused on lithium resources with potential for near to mid-term development from both brines and hard rock deposits. There's also exploration for nickel mineralisation in Scotland. We've also got a limited amount of lithium refining capacity already in the UK, and there are clearly several companies, some of who are represented here in the rooms, looking to build out midstream lithium refining capacity in the UK, capitalising on potentially low carbon energy sources and hydrogen economy in parts of the country. In South Wales, we do have nickel refining capacity in the UK. That's not currently being exploited in terms of the production of nickel sulfate to feed into a lithium-ion battery value chain. I think in terms of opportunities for the UK, we do need to identify those areas for priority interventions. We're a world-class producer of needle coke, which is a precursor for anode material for lithium-ion batteries, but the vast majority of that material is currently exported over chip seas, primarily to China. So I think that's a classic example of an area where there's an obvious potential for development of part of the UK lithium-ion battery chain, which could bring more value into the UK economy.
Thank you. Andy McDonald, please.
Thanks, Chair. Paul, can I come back to you again? How, in terms of the sufficiency of supply of the critical minerals, how confident are you that there is that sufficiency of supply for the vehicles that are either built here or sold here?
I don't think we can currently be confident that we are going to be able to fulfill the raw material demand requirements of the UK for building out gigafactories. We don't have any established cathode active material plants planned for the UK. That material is a prerequisite for building lithium-ion battery cells. I think if you look at the geopolitical landscape, and people have alluded to the rate at which the US and some European countries are now moving in this space, it's extremely competitive. Because of our lack of domestic production capability, we're almost entirely dependent currently on imports, so we're competing in that in the international market with many other countries that are also looking to transition to net zero. So whilst there are opportunities for the UK, we're also starting to see significant deficits in some battery raw material markets, and those that are moving into slight surplus now are also remaining very tight. So again, that means there's significant competition in the market for those materials.
Well, we've got our UK criticals minerals strategy. Does that really address this issue around sufficiency properly? Don't know whether anybody would like to.
Not yet.
Not yet.
No. No, I mean, I think the critical mineral strategy needs to be driven by an industrial strategy to build electric vehicles, build battery plants here. One gigafactory is the size of a football stadium. Yeah. We need at least 4 of them. That's about £20 billion worth. It doesn't have to all come from the government. 15 billion can come from industry, but that 20 billion unlocks the opportunities for the rest of the supply chain, unlocks the electric vehicle industry here in the UK. And so, but in terms of just touching exactly what Paul said, geologically there's no problem with these raw materials. It's getting them out of the ground quick enough. It's 10-year horizons to plan for this. And so when we're planning gigafactories, we've got to be ensuring that the UK's missed the boat on the first round. It's probably missed the boat on the second round of supply of these critical minerals. You've got to make sure we don't miss the boat on the third and probably final round, and that's 2030 onwards.
What happened to miss the boat so badly on those 2 occasions? Where were we as a nation?
We build battery plants.
We just didn't do it.
No. And you have to question what the automotive companies in the UK are doing here. What are the big chemical companies in the UK doing here? They weren't plugged into batteries. When China was, when Japan was, when Korea was, when the US was, when the European Union was, what were the big automotive UK companies doing? What were the big chemical guys doing? INEOS.
Yeah.
What are they doing? They're not even talking about lithium-ion batteries as a serious multi-billion-pound industry, when that's exactly what it is for everybody else in the world. And I think that's the key. That's the crux for me.
When the government's told us that we've got pockets of mineral wealth, that's what we've been told. I mean, to what extent do we have those supplies in the UK?
So we do have pockets of mineral wealth, and Paul and his team have identified, I think, 8 across the UK, but they are not sufficient to deliver the minerals that we require. But the southwest certainly, and it's not just lithium. So if you go in the southwest, you've got tin and tungsten, you've got nickel up in Scotland, so copper in Northern Ireland. So there are areas that we have, but they're not sufficient. Therefore, we need to go and secure minerals globally from nations that are wealthy, do have good geology. The problem is they are tied into agreements now, sending almost everything to China, where the midstream is globally. Now, China has the absolute monopoly, so this is not a free market. The idea, and the government has consistently said we don't want to disrupt free markets. This is not a free market globally. This is a geopolitical monopolized market.
Yeah.
And you only have to look at the legislation that China passed in 2020 that said that it would pass legislation that could allow it to stop export of critical minerals to countries or companies that were against their national interest. So we have that situation to deal with.
Comment?
Just on the point of domestic production, I mean, the key point to recognise is this major disconnect between the time it takes to bring new supply online in terms of mining and refining capacity because of the development timescales relative to the time it takes to build out industrial gigafactory capacity. On average, globally, it's probably in the order of about 10 years to bring a new mining operation online, if not in excess of that. And that's if permitting goes very smoothly. So we've got this major disconnect between supply and demand.
Could I ask anybody who wants to answer this question? This is a layperson asking, so I just want you to put me out of my misery, really, because I've been hearing about the spoils of oil and gas exploration and the lithium deposits that are produced as a result of that. I assume that it's of small beer and not particularly relevant, but can you just finish it off for me, somebody?
Well, the small beer here in the UK.
Yeah.
I don't think that's correct.
No.
I think we have got an opportunity. For one thing, is that some historical work that was done by the BGS outlined the fact that the St Austell granite in Cornwall is the biggest lithium deposit in the whole of Europe. There's no doubt about that. How much of that you can actually mine is a different question, but it is the biggest. And also that we have what is rapidly emerging as a potentially large-scale brine opportunity in the UK. It's a relatively early stage, but nevertheless it is here, and it is geologically very special. So we do have some opportunities here. The difficulty, as ever, and as a former investment banker, I'm probably qualified to say this, and have done this all my career, raising money for an industry in the UK when the odds are stacked against you, there's incentives in the US and everywhere else in the EU, is very difficult. Not impossible, but very difficult. So the critical mineral strategy is great, but it's a wish list with no substance in terms of finance.
I'm going to see Richie.
Yeah, and just from a global perspective, it is a lithium land grab. I said it in the written evidence, and that means with lithium prices where they're at now, where they're going to be in the next at least 10 years and beyond, everything's in play. Every deposit with lithium in is in play, and the rest of the world is rushing to explore for it, develop for it, and put it into production. And that includes oil-filled brines, but it includes all the other traditional sources of lithium, which isn't a rare element. But the hardest thing is putting money in the ground to get it into the supply chain, and that takes a while because it is a speciality chemical. It's not a commodity.
So, Jeff and Jeremy, what does government need to do to scale up? What support do companies need to scale up for this supply of battery minerals to come on stream?
Right. So it's quite a simple answer, to be honest with you. It's to financially support the critical mineral strategy. So the strategy and the refresh are good, and you look at where the government has gone from in 2020, someone in Parliament saying there was no critical mineral problem, to where we are now. We've got a minister, we've got a very active minister, very good. But without the money to back it up, it's just words, and not since Genesis chapter 1 verse 3 has anyone said something that actually happened. Yeah. So the reality is we need to back this. Now I think it's just shy of $1 trillion on the current amount to deliver every single gigafactory that the world says it requires. I think Simon's got the figures on what that would be in the UK. Right. We need the government to start helping financially support these projects. That means from the upstream, so those projects that are strategically important, through the midstream, we need to win that midstream battle, and all the way down into supporting gigafactories. But gigafactories are a very small part. And there's ways that the government could do that without spending much money. So you could underwrite offtake agreements, which would be a relatively cheap way of doing it. You could introduce flow-through shares, which would be a good way of financing smaller exploration. So there are ways it can be done, but without the finance, why and how do we compete with our friends/competitors?
I think I'd also like to say, and that's absolutely right, what Jeff's just said. it's also being seen to be serious. It's not stand back, we don't quite know what's happening here, we're not sure whether we're determined to build this or not. It's to be seen to be serious. The US has now backed it and seen to be very serious, backed it with finance. The EU is seen to be very serious and backed it with finance. The Chinese have been doing this they planned this decades ago. So they don't really need to be seen because they've already dominated the industry. So I think it's really that the UK has an awful lot to offer in terms of chemical engineering full stop, innovation. We're finding that with what we're doing in trying to build this out in Cornwall, that once the UK industry wakes up with government lead to say that we are serious, we've got what it takes, there's some really clever people out there who suddenly wake up and says, we can do that, not a problem. Yeah. We've got companies who sprung out of Manchester University, Oxford University, who have woken up to the imperative and are trying to do it, but the government is sort of almost hanging back, we feel.
So the EU's got its EU Critical Minerals Act, and that sets out benchmarks. Should we be doing something similar here? Is there a need for that?
In my view, absolutely. That's what I mean, being serious.
Yeah.
You know, the EU has put that 10% of the material that goes into batteries must be sourced in the UK, in the EU. That is laying down the law. We've laid down the law that by 2035, all vehicles have to be, or 2035, have to be zero emission. We haven't followed that through with what does the UK industry need to do to get there.
And just on that point, it's not just building a new industry, it's saving the auto industry, the mainstream auto industry. The technology shift in electric vehicles is so aggressive. It has been for the last 8 years, but especially the last 3 years. In the UK, we've kind of hesitated and missed it. And the rest of the world is producing, well, China certainly, and the US is about to increase its electric vehicle output backed with American-made batteries. And the supply chain will follow afterwards. It's just we haven't done any of that yet.
Yeah. We've got a number of agreements with countries for the supply of raw materials. We've got South Africa, Saudi Arabia, Canada and Australia. Are there any other countries we should be seeking to prioritise the partnerships with in pursuit of this? Is anybody else we should be looking to?
I mean, the big ones for lithium, Australia, Chile, Argentina. The big ones for nickel, Indonesia. 65% of the nickel will come from Indonesia in 10 years' time, 50% already this year, and rising. Of course, with Indonesia, that's Chinese money. That's been increasing supply there. Graphite's everywhere, but it's actually investing in the deposits that are near-term production to actually get that material to make anode for the batteries. But the key thing is that the UK doesn't have to just do the deals themselves. It's got to attract the midstream of the supply chain, the big companies there that build these battery plants, build the cathode and anode plants in the middle, to then give them enough incentive to go and get those raw materials themselves. Now, if it's a government-backed contract, for example, say the lithium now from 2030 onwards is up for grabs. Pretty much all of it's gone up until 2030, for example. But I know major lithium companies that would do UK government-backed contracts to then entice the midstream to come and set up here. It's that incentive you need, because otherwise they'll say, well, building a battery plant in the EU is much more attractive. Building one in North America is definitely much more attractive. So it's kind of, it's using not just money, but also kind of supply chain incentives to kind of build this industry here.
Thank you. Mark Pawsey, please.
Thank you. I'm hearing a pretty bleak picture at the minute, but I want to understand the importance of processing the minerals that you're talking to us about. In the UK, I think one of our witnesses said that it made greatest sense to process the minerals at the point where they're brought out of the ground, because I think, Jeff, you might have said that. There's less transportation then involved in the finished product. Of the minerals that are needed, I'm hearing that lithium is the one that's most abundant in the UK and the one where we've got probably the greatest possibility of doing that. But how practical is it going to be to Jeremy, to get this out of the ground and process it here in the UK so that we've got a marketable product?
We consider it's going to be very practical, but we're never going to. I mean, the Faraday Institute and the Automotive Transformation Centre have stated that the UK needs 80,000 tonnes of lithium carbonate equivalent by 2030, we are not going to be able to produce that.
Presumably it only needs that if we've got the battery factories to use it, and we haven't even dug in the ground yet, have we?
Absolutely, that's the problem. That if we want to maintain our automotive industry, we want to build batteries, we need that much lithium. So can we process it? Yes, we can. We're working, as I said, with a number of British companies, and we've tested our brines in Cornwall all over the world. There's nobody said that it can't be done. Absolutely nobody. They've all said
great respect. Nobody saying it can't be done is a little different from everybody saying it can be done.
No,
so tell us how positive you are.
They're all saying it can be done, and I'm saying it can be done. So from our work, it can be done. We're already doing that in Cornwall right now.
And the resource that you got access to, would that meet the UK's need only, or have you got a product that you can then sell to other battery manufacturers around the world?
If there's no demand in the UK, we'll sell it abroad. So, yeah.
But if there is demand in the UK, the resources that you have would simply serve the UK market. It's not.
Yes.
Wouldn't be
it wouldn't fulfil all the demand if there's ambition, but it would. So every tonne we can produce here is a tonne we don't have to import.
And Jeff, let's say that Jeremy's product starts coming out of the ground and it's available for use here in the UK. There are other products that you painted a pretty difficult picture on that have been monopolised by other battery manufacturers, other countries. How if we get Jeremy's material, are we going to be able to easily get the other materials as well?
There's multiple questions in there. So the first one is, if we don't get Cornish Lithium or some of these front-running companies up and running, then what message are we sending to the world? That's number one. So it's an absolute must. It's not an if, it's a must. We must do this. That's number one. Number two, as Simon said, we are late to the game, and we are not as attractive as our friends/competitors like the US or the EU at the moment. Now, we can go and build relationships. So we've done one recently with Kazakhstan, but then so have 6 other nations. Same with South Africa. So it's not that we're outliers and we've been really clever. It's that we've matched what other nations are doing. We can, and again, it's not nations, it's companies. So as long as companies have a company to sell their products to, their offtake to, then they'll sell it there. But unless we can underwrite that, unless we can bring that to the UK and explain why, and give the UK companies here a reason for building that supply chain, it can go anywhere.
And are there some of these critical minerals where China actually has got a stranglehold, or are there always going to be alternative sources of supply?
China has a near monopoly on all of them. And that's because they started this project in, I think, 1978.
Okay, so perhaps I'll move to somebody else if I may. What's the dangers of the position the world has allowed China to get itself into, Paul?
I think there are opportunities, and you're starting to see that between countries like the UK, US, Canada, Australia, looking at opportunities to develop critical mineral value chains outside China.
Okay, so are these countries coming together to provide competition for the material from China, or have China already got it and the other countries are going to have to negotiate with the Chinese?
No, they're seeking to cooperate together to develop value chains outside China. I think, again, coming back to what we were talking about earlier, the challenge is the timescales and the ability of those countries to be competitive with China, looking at energy costs, the technology that resides in China, and the very well established value chains that the Chinese have built up over many decades.
Okay. Jeremy?
There is precedent for the Chinese having already weaponized rare earths by refusing to export what is essentially a monopoly and they absolutely did weaponize it. They said, we're not exporting anymore.
Okay, tell us a bit more about that, and what are the dangers that it may exist on some of these other materials.
I think that there is in modern technologies such as what we require for electrification of our industry, our economy and our society, these metals are critical. So we've before had, obviously, coal, hydrocarbons drove our economy. These are our future economy is going to be driven by interactions between metals, and other materials, exchanging electrons between lithium, nickel, etc. If we don't have access to those metals, we are nowhere. That is as simple as that. And if we let other people monopolise it, we're in serious trouble.
Okay, Simon.
And just so we're clear on what China, their strategy is in lithium-ion batteries, China doesn't mine these critical minerals, a lot of them domestically. But it does refine, it does create cathode anode, it does create battery cells. It absolutely built massive capacity of the midstream. What happens then? Well, that's where your customers are based, the raw materials flow there, and then it generates trillions of dollars, pounds of value downstream, electric vehicles and energy storage. So China doesn't have a lot of these critical minerals domestically, but it does own the midstream, and that's a lesson.
Okay, Jeff.
So Jeremy said that it's been weaponized in the past. So it was February the 16th. So China put Lockheed Martin and part of Raytheon on their unreliable entities list because they sold arms to Taiwan. So now those two companies struggle with rare earths from China. Yeah. So it has been weaponized in 2010. China did the same. A Chinese trawler went into Japanese waters.
Your concern is this may happen in the future with these materials, and that we may have some grand plans for what we might want to do in terms of electrification and building batteries, but we may be restricted from doing so because of the stranglehold that the Chinese have on the market. Is that really?
They can already manipulate prices. They can already raise or drop prices as they deem fit. They have legislation in place to stop the export. They have control of the midstream. I genuinely hope, I truly hope that it never happens. But if we don't prepare for it, and if we don't build an alternative, then we are putting ourselves, and it's not just electric vehicles, it's everything. The entire integrated review, all the 5 points raised in the integrated review, are dependent on critical minerals. The entire UK industrial strategy, the Western industrial strategy, is based on critical minerals. At the moment, we are entirely dependent on China, and that seems to me like a very, very silly position to be in.
Okay. In terms of critical minerals, can I move on to recycling? Because one of the things that we may be able to do is reduce our need for new materials by recycling those that we've already got. Now, I recognise that we haven't got the volume right now, but to what extent will recycling, repurposing old batteries, enable us to have the electrified future that we're all looking for? Mr. Simony.
Yeah, I mean, in a best case scenario, long term, 20%. Because what you're dealing with is massive growth in the market, and you're playing catch up with recycling. Also, recycling batteries is a nascent industry. It might be a familiar topic for many decades, but actually doing that at scale with the chemistries and the formats of batteries coming into the market, it's different. It's highly technical, I think even more so than people expect. And then the key lesson for me is what critical minerals can you easily take out of the battery and use them back in a battery. So for nickel and cobalt, it's easier. For things like lithium and graphite, much harder.
Sorry, yes, Jeff.
Go for it.
I mean, the fundamental thing, both in terms of processing materials in the UK and adding value here, but also in terms of recycling material within the economy, it will become an imperative because of mandated minimum recycled content levels that we will be adopting within batteries, which means if we don't have that material in the economy to utilise in battery manufacturing, we're not going to be able to sell into some markets like the European Union.
So there's a legislative imperative to recycling, but is there a security of supply imperative, and how far away are we getting to that?
Can I try and answer that one? So we've been using copper for 4,000 years, and the copper market at the moment is about 22 to 24,000 million tonnes a year, of which only 30% of that is from recycled material, roughly that. Maybe a bit more, maybe a bit less. But we will never be able to...
Is that because we're not recycling effectively, or because the demand is increasing massively?
The growth in demand, because global population growth is outstripping that ability to supply. So I think, yes, it will be an opportunity to have some recycled material, but it's actually misleading ourselves if we think we can rely on recycling.
And it just underlines that recycling is a crucial component in building a sustainable battery supply chain, but it underlines more how important mining is.
Okay, all right. Sorry, Jeff, quickly.
One last thing. So it's all well and good, and we need to recycle the batteries and the rest of the car, absolutely. But once it's recycled, you don't just put it straight back into another. You've got to put it through the midstream again, right? So if we don't capture the midstream in the UK, we have to send it abroad to be done, right? And if we do that, and we're asking, and the government's goal is security of supply, you're already undermining your own ambition. So that's why the midstream is such an important part of this.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Jeff, I just want to follow up. Obviously, there are geopolitical, industrial policy questions about the UK not getting this right, and you said earlier that we must get it right. Just specifically for the automotive industry, my assumption is that if we don't catch up, as you suggested, Simon, basically over time, car companies will make decisions to relocate new production lines in other countries where these supply chains exist, and we'll just see the decline of automotive manufacturing in the UK. Is that a correct assumption?
I sadly think that's true, and that's 800,000 people's jobs on the line, and we just can't accept that.
Yeah. Okay. And I think I can't remember who said it, but someone said we need British batteries, like American and European batteries. Are we large enough to compete in that way? Jeremy, do you have a view on that?
Are we?
Someone, forgive me, I didn't write down who said it, but Simon, thank you.
Yeah.
So Simon said earlier that we should have British batteries in the same way there'll be American-made batteries, and if you talk to Northvolt, European-made batteries. My question was, is the British economy big enough to have British-made batteries alongside American and European ones?
I think the answer is yes, it is, but it also has to be. So if we don't, we give away a huge component of value add. I think that the automotive industry is a very large percentage of GDP already. So it's not whether we certainly can. Technologically, we can produce British batteries, no question about that. But we also have to, because otherwise we miss out. We're exporting jobs to China or wherever. If we want to do that, that's fine, but it's a slow and steady industrial decline.
And the UK car industry, 4 million cars and engines, for example, that's 5-6 gigafactories worth just for domestic demand. Then the same batteries can also be used for energy storage for solar and wind to make that industry more effective. So there's a lot of room for domestic.
Just check, when you say 5 to 6 gigawatts for domestic demand, that includes the cars that we export?
Yeah, everything.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sorry, Paul, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, it was just really picking up on this point because of the UK-EU trade cooperation agreement. Again, it's going to be vital that we're actually manufacturing cells and ideally cathode active material in the UK to be able to demonstrate that we're adding sufficient value in the UK economy to comply with the rules of origin around minimum originating requirements within the UK economy to be able to continue to export cars to the EU, which is our largest export market with zero tariffs.
And so if we don't hit those targets, the export numbers will fall through the floor because they won't meet the regulatory requirements.
Absolutely. We'll certainly won't be competitive in terms of exporting into the EU market. Our second largest car export market is the US again. So with the backdrop of the IRA and the subsidies that the US is putting in place, again, it makes exports to the US look particularly uncompetitive.
Because to get the subsidy in America, you have to make it in America.
Exactly, yes.
So there'll be American-made for domestic consumption in the US, which could reduce the potential for UK exports to the US because they're making their own. And then we risk not being able to export to the EU if we don't meet the regulatory requirements. And then we're stuffed, aren't we, really?
Yes, when you put it like that, it's relatively pessimistic.
Okay, we'll try and be more positive, but for now, thank you to all four of you. Thank you very much. We're now moving on to panel 2, where we're going to welcome Stephen Gifford, who's the Chief Economist at the Faraday Institution, Alan Hollis, who's the Chief Executive of AMTE Power, which is a British company making batteries, and Ian Constance, who's the Chief Executive of the Advanced Propulsion Centre here in the UK. So we'll just let you swap over, we'll get you some clean cups and get your names set out. Thank you. Some fresh water. And it's quite warm in here today. Sorry about that. Yes. Great. Okay, well, we'll get going. Stephen Gifford, I'm going to come to you first, because the Faraday Institution has been doing a lot of work over the last few years about UK demand and how many gigafactories we need and how many gigawatts we need and how we support the automotive sector in the UK. I just want to pick up with where I left off on panel 1 and to see if you can help me. I can understand if the market stood still and we said we're producing this number of cars today, and if you assume they're all going to be electric vehicles, you would need this number of batteries and therefore this number of gigafactories and this amount of supply chain, and that all kind of stacks up and makes sense. But the clock is ticking and things are moving quite quickly, it seems, in both of our largest export markets. How do you track over time if there is a decline in the future projections for manufacturing numbers in the UK, what the underlying battery capacity requirements have to be in order to meet that declining sector, if indeed you agree it is declining?
Well, I wouldn't target a declining sector as an ambition, really. So I think, as a minimum, you target a stable automotive industry. And with a stable automotive industry, and I'm thinking about the period 2015 to 2019, not obviously counted the period of the COVID pandemic and the global recovery after that. If you target that as a long-term ambition for the automotive, some people argue we can't just have stable automotive, we need to have grown. But under that, the requirements by 2040 with the overall EV sales projections and also other, not just passenger EVs, but HGVs, micromobility, grid storage, then the projection for battery demand is around 200 gigawatts, which is about 10 gigafactories each with about 20 gigawatt hours. I mean, gigafactories can be all sorts of differing size, but you know, if you think about it, a gigafactory about of that order, that's probably what you need. Which means, tracking back to 2030, we need to have 5 gigafactories in place by 2030. Tracking back then that you need, and that's about 100 gigawatt hours demand. Tracking back then you need typically 2 or 3 years to develop a gigafactory to get it up to speed, and then maybe 1 or 2 years planning before that. So you're looking at, we've already got one in the pipeline in Envision in Sunderland, Envision AAC, but we need at least 2 or 3 to be up and, to be decided in the next 2-3 years to be able to hit those 2030 targets, to be on track. So we've not missed it, but we certainly haven't got a lot of time to catch up, and this race is clearly not over yet.
The evidence from the first panel that troubled me slightly was I can see how if you want to build a gigafactory, you need to find a site, you build a building, you get a grid connection, you hopefully get some workers. Ideally, you do a deal with a car manufacturer and you're kind of near the car manufacturer in order to do that. That feels like a kind of neat package to me. There's lots of problems in that, but you can kind of visualize it. The concerns from the first panel, though, were the supply chain that underpins it and the regulatory environment that requires us not just to import stuff from China if we're going to be able to meet EU regulatory standards. So you talk about delivering 5, 10 gigafactories. What confidence do you have that actually we can get the supply chain robust enough to actually underpin those gigafactories being viable commercial entities?
Well, I think the immediate supply chain, slightly upstream, is the important thing to focus on. So many of the panel members talked about cathode active material. So that's obviously the components that go into the cell manufacturing. So you've got an anode, cathode, and electrolyte. Those 3 parts of manufacturing then go into the cell manufacturing, and then the cell goes into pack manufacturing. So I think you're targeting the next level up in the stream is very important, and that will really help with all the regulations around rules of origin, etc. Then moving further down the supply, I don't think it's an answer of yes, we need all raw materials from the UK or we don't. What is important, because of the Chinese monopoly on this, is a diversification of supply. So anything that the UK can do to help in the diversification of the supplies is helpful. Anything that you could shift the demand slightly away from China, direct relationships with Australia with the new trade deal, also help with diversification. So that gives the security of supply across that sort of raw materials edge. So I think it's important, that's the thing about diversification of supply rather than either or, UK or not UK.
Alan Hollis, you're doing this for real. Should I be less depressed after the first? No offense to the previous witnesses, but it seemed pretty difficult. Is there hope?
Well, I actually wrote down, we shouldn't be so downbeat about the UK battery industry. From my perspective, the UK has got a rich history in developing battery technology. I think where we've got a significant opportunity to improve is in the commercialization of the cell technology. And that's the stage that we're in as a business. So there are many problems and challenges that we need to overcome. There are also many different sizes and types of Gigafactory. So there's the 30 gigawatt hour Gigafactory to support very high volume automotive applications, and there's smaller scale Gigafactories like the one that we're planning to put up, which is specifically focused on serving the lower volume, higher value add manufacturers that we have in the UK for automotive and for energy storage. And we mustn't forget, the thing that the UK is really good at, which is, high technology, low volume, high value add. And we've got to always bear in mind that we need to support that because it's a very, very important part of our economy.
We hear similar evidence to what you've just given in lots of sectors in the UK economy. We're really good at R&D, university partnerships. We're really good at innovation and IP. And then companies, presumably like yours, need to raise $400-500 million, dollars is telling, isn't it, pounds, in order to scale up to provide the British business that will supply the OEMs and others. But so many businesses just don't make it through what I think the tech industry call it the valley of death. How are we going to change this narrative for battery manufacturing?
I think the attitude of the government needs to change to be far more supportive of helping businesses go through the valley of death, because that's you've hit the nail on the head. The UK industry is brilliant at supporting innovation, and without the support from the UK government, we wouldn't have been able to develop the three very unique cell technologies that we've managed to develop. What we need is that extra support just to help bridge through this period of having the technology and commercializing the technology and then building the Gigafactory. It's so important that we find the mechanisms to do that, and really quite urgently, because time is against us, as we heard in the previous panel. The time to start building the Gigafactories, we need to get them up in full production by sort of 2030 at the latest. Time is not on our side, and we need to be taking action now. And I know it's a very difficult thing to do with the multiple challenges that we're all facing all of the time, but it's so critical to UK industry, and in particular the automotive industry, and in particular the very specialised niche manufacturers that we're all proud of here in the UK. It's about government support in whatever form is available.
And I can kind of see how for very expensive cars, maybe F1 cars, maybe the aerospace industry, the UK could kind of carve out a global niche or USP for battery manufacturing in those sectors. Are we going to get there for mass manufacturing?
I think we have to get there for the mass manufacturing. The amount of batteries that are going to be served for the kind of applications you talked about, F1 and aerospace, was significant, and significant for the type of high-tech innovation activity that the UK is great at. The amount will be relatively small. And it's really that ability to serve those volume sectors of the car market that really bring an industry with you. They bring that quantity of gigafactories that Stephen talked about, and that your prior panel talked about the supply chain. The way we see it in APC is that the gigafactories, the big gigafactories, are really the keystone elements, and because it's all riven with chicken and eggs, this whole story. So if you don't attract the big gigafactories, the 10 to 30 gigawatt hour kind of facilities, you can't have a sensible discussion with people doing the rest of those supply chain elements. So it all kind of unfolds from there.
We essentially need car manufacturers in the UK to sign up to some deals with companies that are viable to supply in the UK? We need to get to that point pretty quickly, right?
And that we do, and therein lies a bit of the weakness that you see in the UK industry. You would have a couple of very big car producers. One of them's already made their decision. The other one's in process of making their decision. They are key because they are those cornerstone investments that you can build an industry around and a supply chain around. The rest of the industry is quite fragmented. It's those smaller players. They will need access to batteries. They will need to form alliances in order to create the scale that brings gigafactories along, and that requires a bit of time, which sort of answers one of the questions, which is why do we appear to be a bit behind some of the others?
Alan, if I'm one of those big car manufacturing companies and I say I want to do the right thing by the British economy, I want to sign a contract with a UK-based company to supply me batteries for my future needs, who is the customer? Who is the contractor that I sign up, the supplier that I sign up to? For the batteries. Who's going to sign the contract to supply the batteries I need if I'm a big car manufacturer?
Well, that's it will be a company like ours. Depending on the volumes that we're talking about. But we have to create the environment where we can attract the inward investment to build the gigafactories, because they're expensive things to build, even on a relatively small scale. We're talking, 250 million, for a 30 gigawatt hour facility, you could be talking like 3 billion. They're expensive, and therefore the funding necessary to invest is it's enormous, and we have to attract that investment in, and it's very difficult at this particular moment in time when you see what's happening in the US with IRA, you see what's happening in Europe, with all the incentives that are available. The people with the money are sort of tending to place it in other locations rather than focusing it on the innovative businesses like ourselves, who have got the technology, and we just need to take it to market.
Okay, Mark Pawsey, please.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to understand a little bit more about the competitive environment that we're working on, and perhaps start with Stephen, if I may, because Stephen, in 2012, Envision's plant in Sunderland was the first in Europe to produce batteries at scale, and we haven't really done a massive amount since then, and we've seen growth in places like Germany and Hungary. How have they done well, and we've sort of lagged behind?
Well, I think definitely we are behind. So that's correct. I think it's a mixed bag in Europe. Some countries done very well. Some countries haven't done so well. So Eastern European has been concentrating gigafactories quite successfully, partly initially because of the competitive nature of labour costs, etc., and land as well. But Germany recently has been very successful in gigafactories as well. So overall, I think there's probably about 30 gigafactories in the pipeline in Europe, whereas we have maybe one or class two if you class the small one there at the moment. So it's quite competitive. But overall in the global economy, it's China, as we heard from the previous panel, where almost all the gigafactories are. But I think there's certainly time to develop those gigafactories in the UK, because we have a strong automotive industry, we have a very flexible labour force, we have highly skilled people both in jobs and in the research communities. So we have all the ingredients here for us to be successful. And I think there's probably three ways to think about how you could develop the industry. So typically governments in Eastern European have had direct relationships with Asian manufacturers and brought them in, very much in order of like the 1980s in Nissan. So bringing in, and that's a success. Maybe it's not a British battery, but it's certainly a foreign country investing in the UK. You could do that. That's one model. The second model is about OEMs signing their own agreements with either UK battery manufacturers or other non-UK battery manufacturers in building a gigafactory here. And then you have the third model, which is potentially the most risky and higher cost of capital, is the greenfield sites such as British Vault, which went to develop its own plant without any IP and developed its own IP. So it's much more risky way of approaching, and very few gigafactories have been successful in that model. Northvolt in Sweden have been successful in the greenfield site, but very few others have been more about traditional bringing Asian battery manufacturers in or OEM relationships.
And Ian, is the principle that vehicle assembly will take place adjacent to where the batteries are made because the battery makes up such a high proportion of the value and the weight of the vehicle? Is that I mean, that was one reason why Envision built their battery plant in Sunderland. Does that principle still apply? Is it always going to apply, or might we not be at such a disadvantage if we want to retain vehicle assembly if the batteries are happen to be made elsewhere? Arguably, it might give an OEM the opportunity to play one battery manufacturer off against another and perhaps get a better deal than locking themselves into a Solus agreement with somebody who's next door.
Yeah, I think the prevailing view of the industry is absolutely that we have to have battery manufacturing where we have vehicle assembly. And that's because, as you said, these things are very heavy, they're very bulky, they're expensive to ship. Actually, they're in their safest and their best condition when they're packed in a pack which goes into the car, and you wouldn't ship them in that form. They can get damaged. There's a huge amount of working capital tied up in very long supply chains. So there's lots of reasons why making batteries where you make cars, and we think that will be the predominant future. So it's really critical that we get these battery factories.
I understand why battery manufacturers have flocked to Germany, and Germany has provided the incentives for them to be there, but I don't get Hungary. Because are Hungary assembling vehicles?
Hungary do assemble vehicles. There's a lot of vehicle assembly in Eastern Europe.
Is there a danger that our assembly might migrate to where those gigafactories are?
Absolutely there is, and this is all about creating, and you've heard this for a number of times already today, this level playing field of investment. That level playing field of investment cuts through the batteries, but also the vehicle assemblers and the supply chain element. And we hear two things all the time. This level playing field on investment with lots of money being poured in the US and Europe. But the other piece is energy costs. Yeah. Everybody wants green energy to make vehicles and to make their batteries. They don't want batteries that are which are very high energy intense products. They don't want them full of carbon intensity from day one. So they need green energy, but they need that at low cost.
How can we get the consumer to understand that in that case? So if there's a whole load of energy expended in the manufacture of the battery, and I buy an electric vehicle, how do I know whether the battery has been made through a green manufacturing process or a particularly dirty one where they've used the electricity by burning coal?
Well, I think first of all, I think what I see is the vehicle manufacturers are getting religion on this, I would say, and they recognise that this will be a key competitive battleground to demonstrate that their vehicles are zero carbon. Of course, they need to do that at a cost, so they need to work that out.
When I buy an electric car, I've got no idea who made the battery. But should I be asking that question of the salesman attempting to sell me the vehicle?
Well, I think that will be the future.
And how do we raise awareness of that? Then?
Well, I think with there will be carbon border legislation, and I think that will be a key element in creating that environment that you talk about.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Andy McDonald.
Thanks, Chair. We've on European Union UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement. Can I just take our attention back to that for a minute, because the rules of origin are going to be starting to be phased in next year. So can we focusing on that? What sort of challenges do you think that presents to us next year?
It will be a massive challenge because over the next few years there will be a lack of supply, which means and we've seen the battery industry grow significantly in Asia, so a lot of supply is still coming from Asia, which means that people are going to need to quickly work out where they get local batteries from, because that battery element is going to be fundamental. The next piece of it is going to be the cathode active materials, which there is a massive shortfall of in Europe. So and it's going to be billions of pounds worth of investment over the next few years to bring that together.
Anybody to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I would totally agree with what Ian's just said. The demand for electric vehicles is rising exponentially almost. And the whole supply chain across the EU is playing catch-up, whether it's gigafactories or whether it's cathode, the raw materials that go into the gigafactories, cathode active material and anode active material as well. And, my biggest concern is that, with the lack of capacity, cathode active material capacity in particular, is going to be very, very difficult for us to comply fully with the rules of origin. Very difficult.
So it's up for renegotiation.
I think it really does need to be.
So what are the changes do we need to see? Have you got any thoughts on the specific changes we'd like to see from the renegotiation of the TCA?
Well, not to share today, but we can respond later on that if that's okay. But it's we have to take into account the measurable gap between what the production capacity is and what the demand is, and those figures are out there in the market, and we'll come back with some input on that if that's okay.
I mean, just as a concrete suggestion on that, the rules of origin were created, in 2020, before the pandemic, before the energy problems, and before the global hit by the recovery and inflation. So that wasn't envisaged when the TCA was developed. So that's hit most markets, quite hard. So as a minimum, I would suggest an increased length of time for the transition period for the 2027 is when
Yes.
the full implementation. So pushing that back 1 or 2 years would give everyone a breathing space.
Yeah.
But are you just delaying the problem, and is the time enough for the market and for the industry to adapt to 2027? Is that feasible? If you're going to avoid tariffs, everything's got to be of a UK or EU origin. I mean, it's going to cause immense problems.
I think 27 is still going to be a stretch because we, as Alan said, we need to get cathode active material in to meet these rules. So I think actually we need to have a discussion with the battery companies and the supply companies, but I think as a minimum a delay is what the industry would expect.
But if I may, I mean, I think this is where it comes down to us having a very, very clear industrial strategy that covers, it's an end-to-end industrial strategy that covers the whole supply chain. Because we're very good at looking at, the number of gigafactories and the output of those gigafactories. We've got a view on the cathode active material. We've got a view on the refining capacity and the mining capacity. We need to make sure we're looking at the joined up picture so that we can make sure, when we are asking for delays in the implementation of the legislation, that we're quite confident that we've got the right numbers in front of us, and that end-to-end industrial strategy is absolutely key. And dare I say it, the UK really needs to look at that and put in place.
So you're saying we don't actually have the raw data to actually present and say these will be the consequences if we are bound by the phase-in for next year and then the completion of that in 27. Are we able to present the case and set out clearly what the consequences are?
The data that we have today in the Advanced Propulsion Centre quarterly demand report says that on anode materials we'll have about 50% lack of supply across the UK and Europe. On cathode materials, about 25% deficit. And that means 25% of the cars that are traded around Europe are likely to be attracting some kind of potential tariff. And that, in a world where we're trying to encourage people to go to electric cars, is probably an unintended consequence.
Okay. Move us on to a return. We heard earlier about the supply chain challenges that we have. We heard it's not feasible, apparently, or desirable to onshore all elements of the supply chain. Do you all agree that that's the position? Is that that you would all sign up to?
Yeah, I would.
Yeah. So if that's the case, which are the bits that we should be hosting domestically? Which are the key elements and which bits are we content to rely upon importation from overseas?
From our perspective, clearly cell manufacturing, that's the gigafactories, the cathode active materials, and those materials make up CAM and anode active materials, which are largely carbon-based products. Those two, so the cathode and anode, make up about 55% of the value of a cell. And then electrolyte is next, and then separator is after that, and the separator and electrolyte are another 15%. So if we focus on those four elements, we get the lion's share of the value, and we keep it focused. And this comes back to Alan's view about having an industrial strategy that focuses in on what's important.
Yeah, but I would I would also say that agree with Ian. You start off, and I think the previous panel mentioned this too. You start off with a gigafactory, and then because that's ironically perhaps the shortest time to market to build a gigafactory and get it up and running, and that's 4 to 5 years. Then you can start to build the rest of the supply chain around that, and then just throwing something else into the mix. There are other technologies around, like sodium-ion technology, that is something that the UK should be and is investing in, to develop alternative technologies to lithium-ion cells, right, to try and mitigate the need for lithium and cobalt.
Yeah, just to build on that, I very much agree with what elements of the supply chain we can onshore here, pretty much all of it apart from some of the raw materials, I think. As well as those mentioned, there's also added value services around battery manufacturing, the BMS itself, the battery management system, software, recycling, certification and safety testing. All those sorts of elements are building up now as we speak. But also just to reinforce the point about the next generation, and from the earlier session where someone mentioned it started China in 1978 to build this out, where Faraday Institution's looking at the next generation, spends a lot of its research in that area, so sodium ion, lithium sulfur, solid state batteries. So these are the next generation, the 2040s technologies that we need long-term research to continue and be stable amongst those. So sodium is a low-cost abundant material that would solve sodium is everywhere. And it's particularly used for grid storage. You could also use it in developing countries for micro-mobility, very cheap EVs. Lithium sulfur can be used for lightweight applications, particularly defence, aerospace, aviation, and solid state is pretty much very good safety, high performance, and you could use it for many different applications. So these are all in play, and we're leading researchers in this sphere in many of the universities we have in the UK. As you say earlier, it's about commercialisation of that and getting through that valley of death. But as long as we keep the research and commercialisation stable and long term over the time, there's every chance we can do that.
Is that linked ultimately to the supply of these critical materials and mitigating the risks of any interruption in the supply? I mean, you're talking about future technologies. I mean, is enough being done now, and with an eye on the future? Is government doing enough to mitigate the risks to the supply of critical minerals? Anybody?
I would say on the R&D side, I think, as Stephen said, we are in a leading position, one of the leaders on developing these alternative technologies. I don't think they're going to come a lot quicker than they're likely to come. They will be driven by the shortage of critical materials. They will be driven by the technology readiness. They'll be driven by their ability to deliver performance into the market, and they've all got their pros and cons.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. Ian Lavery, please.
Thanks. It's really interesting, I've got to say. British World was in my constituency. So a lot of the things that are being discussed today, it's like news to me, and the tales, etc., and the stories and everything that come with this wonderful proposal, which is going to transform my area and a gigafactory. Lots of what's being said hasn't been said in the past, but I just thought I'd share that with you. Obviously, at the time, the pot of money and the pot of money from government is the UK's Auto Transformation Fund. That's what people looking to apply for. But it's been suggested that that's been overshadowed by investments in other countries such as the US Inflation Reduction Act. I'm just wondering, how does the financial support here in the UK compared to that in say the EU and the US?
Right now, there's no comparison between what's on offer in with IRA and the what's on offer in Europe. That's unfortunate, but that's the reality of where we are. You have UK battery technology developers and manufacturers, because we've been manufacturing on a small scale batteries for the last 20 years. And we now are at that stage where we've developed 3 different technologies and we want to commercialize it. We want to commercialize that product here in the UK. We absolutely want to commercialize that product here in the UK. But it does make the investment decisions difficult, and attracting the large investors that we need to support that level of investment makes it difficult for us to argue the case with our potential investors when they say, well, what's on offer in the US? And 20 to 30%, OPEX costs, sort of covered for the life of the facility. There's some tax support as well. Or in Europe, there's capital grants and other incentives available. And then you get asked the question, well, why do you want to stay in the UK? Well, we want to stay in the UK because we passionately believe it's the right thing to do. We're proud of the UK PLC and the UK industry, and we want to be part of that. And we can see an exceptionally strong future. We just need, as an industry, we need to create the UK battery industry, and that includes the supply chain, so that we can. We've got something to be proud about, and it supports and creates even more jobs than the 800,000 that are currently supported through the UK automotive industry. That's what this discussion is about. It's about how do we protect and create jobs in the future, high-paid, high-skilled jobs, and this is an industry that can do that.
Yeah, the battery making industry, like the car industry, is highly competitive, internationally competitive. If you can't make it at the prevailing cost and with the quality, performance and everything else, you are not going to be in that game, and people aren't going to buy off you. To be able to make it at that cost, you've got to be able to supply everything. You've got to have the investment, the capital investment at a level that is consistent with the best in the world. And the problem is when other nations are putting massive amounts into that creates a situation where doing it somewhere where you're not putting that level of cash in is uncompetitive. And that makes it very difficult for shareholders to make a positive decision if we're not putting the same amounts on the table. And it's like all these things. There's areas where we have strengths, so you might not have to go in directly at the same level as America, because we have, the rules of origin and things like that on our side if we do it right, but we have to be at a level that gets us through the door of these investors. I think there's 2 things. There's the globally mobile international investors who are already big companies making batteries. They won't talk to you unless there's a route through to some de-risking. And then there's this, the people in Alan's situation, building up these technology businesses where getting through that valley of death we heard about earlier requires a sort of an attitude towards risk that is different than the prevailing mood, I think.
Yeah, and just a final point from me on that. I don't think anybody's expecting the UK government to go toe to toe with the US with IRA, or even the schemes that are available in mainland Europe. But there has to be targeted packages of support to grow and develop the industry.
I mean, that's a really important point, because when you look at some of the investments in different parts of the the world, in the EU, in fact, and in the US, it's not uncommon to see investment from governments of, up to £750 million into these projects. It's not uncommon at all.
Yeah.
Yet that's never been the case and isn't the case with the Auto Transformation Fund. Quite the opposite. And I do believe that a lot of the strings that are attached to some of the finances that have been made available are like very, very difficult. But in order to compete, in order to bring gigafactories, I think, depending on who we speak to, we might want 9 gigafactories by 2040, whatever the facts might be, we need gigafactories.
Yeah.
What will the UK government have to step up to the plate? Will they have to be offering £750 million and the likes of it, so we can actually compete and bring gigafactories to the UK?
I wouldn't like to, agree or otherwise on the number, the £750 million, but it needs to be a very sizable sum of money that's available to support the creation of the industry, because that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about creating, one gigafactory. We're talking about creating the UK battery industry, which is an integral part, and that's the whole supply chain. However much we decide to create, but that's what we need to do, and it's an investment, and that investment will pay back multiple times over with jobs, tax, and the general returns that you get from investing in the industry.
How successful has the Auto Transformation Fund been?
From our perspective, we think it is it's an absolutely very positive step in the right direction, and I think it's been very successful in supporting businesses grow and develop. But we're at a different stage of development now. We really are, as an industry, the birth of the industry in the UK battery industry, and we have to, recognise that and really up the investment and the support to create.
Do you think it's delivered what it was supposed to deliver?
I don't know, Ian, do you want to answer that?
I think it was difficult for me to answer that, because I am sort of so closely engaged in the administration of that. I think what we've been able to do with the Automotive Transformation Fund, we have secured 1 gigafactory, and as you know, on the case that didn't make it, we were quite involved in helping that to get where it got to. It was a great disappointment it didn't make it any further, a great disappointment. I think we've done a lot of work on feasibility studies and on scale-up readiness, on helping bring people along to demonstrate they've got investable products. I think we're in a really difficult spot right now because investment in the markets is really, really tight, really difficult to get hold of. And of course, the government's not going to do it all by itself, so we need the investors and we need the government bit coming together.
Yeah.
I mean, I would just add that it's not just about financial support into this industry as well. There's lots more that the government can do. So making sure it's done a top 3 priority for inward investment, making sure all the inward investment agencies are focused on this is one of the 3 things that we should do in terms of inward investment. And as I said, you only need 10 sites, helping to identify those sites, maybe giving some of those sites special interests around enterprise zones, providing some subsidies to level the playing field on energy costs, for example, and then do all the things around what governments always should do, which is skills development, research and R&D. There's a huge amount of things rather than just concentrating on the money, the financial side. That's very important, but there's other things as well that government should do.
I think my questions were basically on the Auto Transformation Fund, but I accept what you say. With regards to the Inflation Reduction Act, has that had much of an impact on battery manufacturing in the UK? Has it had an impact And how do you think that the UK government perhaps could respond to that?
Well, what we're seeing is companies across this whole industrial picture, regardless if they're in batteries or other EV manufacturing or other bits of the supply chain, are telling us every day that they are encouraged to go to the US because of the level of incentive that's on the table. And their investors are much less interested in supporting them in the UK, so it is having a significant impact, yes.
Thank you. Jane.
Thank you very much, Chair. My question's on workforce to all of you, please, if I may. Alan, you talked about time not being on our side in an earlier answer. And Stephen, you talked about that we have a flexible labour force in the UK. But you've also just mentioned to Ian about skills development, and maybe that's where the government should be involved. So what can the government do to ensure that the UK has sufficient numbers of suitably qualified staff to support battery manufacturing in the UK? And should it be possible to train, recruit and upskill the UK workforce in time to meet that short time scale that Alan referred to? Or indeed, should the government get out of the way? Alan, do you want to go first?
Yes. So, if you look at the time scale required to build a gigafactory, 4 years, on average, from start to finish. I think that is an adequate time to train and develop, or retrain and develop, the necessary skills and the workforce. The battery industry needs, high-skilled jobs, and they are high-skilled jobs that require certain skill sets that, we all know what those are, and I can run through them at a later stage if you want. But what we've got to do is to make sure that we are working with local authorities, working with the Faraday Institute, to set up apprentice schemes and local colleges in the areas where we're going to put our gigafactory, so that we can start to, we've got a jobs manifesto, and we're going to start to train and develop, and that needs to start a couple of years at least before you're going to start a production in the gigafactory, probably earlier than that. I mean, we're looking 30 months before start of production, because you do need to train and develop the skill, train and develop the people. We've got some really good facilities in the UK as well, like the UK BIC that this government's invested in. We're a prime user of that facility. And we intend to use our own plant up in Thurso and the UK BIC as part of the training that we need to impart into our people. But it's a big task. We're talking about if we do have 6 to 8 gigafactories by 2030. Or 2040, then a workforce of like 30,000 people in the battery industry, and that's a sizable number of people to train and develop, and we absolutely need to be thinking about that now, and I know we are.
Thank you very much. So, Stephen, then that's almost a supply chain of people in itself. What do you think?
Well, I very much agree with what Alan said there. It's a problem that is eminently attackable by institutions and stuff. I think the key thing, as always with skills, is we've been involved in quite a lot of initiatives ourselves in doing this. The skills electrification skills framework, for example, along with other partners in that, developing the strategy for it. I think what's needed is sort of someone of a higher level to own it and help out, whether that's at the government level or whether it's a sector skills council or something like that, who can push it forward to give the overall. There's so many different organisations involved, and in advance of what many of the companies will do the skills training themselves, they need to have in place delivery partners who know what the curriculums are. What the qualifications, the BTEC level 2s, BTEC level 3s, all those sorts of detail you need in advance of being able to. You just can't say, right, tomorrow I'm going to start training. Yep. You need all that kind of infrastructure in place beforehand, and that's where some sort of strategic oversight is going to be helpful to make sure that everyone's heading in the right direction.
Thank you very much. And Ian, following on from that then, so yes, a workforce in place and hopefully ready to go, but then this next generation coming forward as well. How can we get our front foot forward, if you like, and get ahead on that already?
I think the skills subject is so broad, isn't it? I mean, you've got to have a national level kind of approach which covers the degree level and upwards, and I think we're pretty good at that. I think the issues come when we're talking about those lower sort of manufacturing level skills and things like that, and that has to happen on a more local basis. Yes. Now, I think when we talked about earlier the great work that's happening in research and development and looking out to those future technologies where the UK is pretty good, I'm afraid this comes back to developing those supply chains, because actually some of the processes will change on some of those technologies, but a lot of it, the sort of roll-to-roll, fast-paced production of these high-volume batteries, a lot of those skills are going to stay the same. And then a lot of the things like just high voltage capability and things like that are things we just need to do a lot more of across the country for this electric vehicle sort of revolution and rollout that's going to happen.
Yes, very exciting. Thank you very much. One more question then, please, on energy costs this time and energy costs of production. You might just want to give me your general thoughts and a general rant. But I'm wondering what you're doing in terms of planning for the future now that we know that prices go up and down. Yep, they do. So what can we do to make sure it's more even for this particular set of production? Ian, do you want to go first this time?
So the energy intensive industries tariff is a massive help for battery makers and is now going to be applicable in that space, which is really helpful, because we think as we get through the current energy crisis, longer term, we're likely to see a much better situation here. But I think with respect to getting investment in this space, the energy question, after that investment level playing fields, is the second biggest thing. And it's a big concern where our energy prices aren't competitive. At a wholesale level, we're very competitive because we're creating a lot of green energy at a good cost. Yep. The issue is when we put our levies and so on to pay for that green transformation on, we become uncompetitive with our peer nations. And so what we've got to do is benchmark ourselves rigorously with our competitor nations, make sure we can deliver green energy at a competitive cost.
Super, thank you. Alan.
Totally agree with what Ian's just said. Energy is a major cost, in terms of the running of a gigafactory, and it has to be competitive, because we are in a global industry, and we have to keep a very close eye on the costs of production, whether that's raw materials, whether it's energy or people costs even, and we can do lots and lots of things to focus on productivity. But if energy costs are double what our European counterparts are paying, then that's a major challenge for us, and we can never recoup that because of the importance of the cost of energy and the cost of the product.
Understood. Thank you. Stephen, all of the above?
So I definitely agree with that. I'd probably make a slightly different point about we're moving to a renewables grid, wind, solar, but sometimes the wind doesn't blow, sometimes the sun doesn't blow, sometimes more demand in winter. What you need to actually drive down the costs of the grid is batteries for those. Yeah. So just to circulate, what we need batteries for, not just EVs, but also the grid.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Quite right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Just a quick one on energy costs and the assistance to the energy intensive industries. Mm-hmm. Is that comprehensive enough? Or we talked about the supply chain throughout this afternoon's session. Are all the relevant industries included in the assistance given for this purpose? Are there other people left out?
I think my answer to that would be, if we can't deliver energy at a competitive cost to those peer nations, we're going to struggle on investment across the board as this EV revolution takes part.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ian, I just want to follow up. You mentioned earlier about your relationship at the Advanced Propulsion Centre with British Volt. Could you just explain that a little bit further? Did you have to manage the relationship on behalf of government?
Well, the Advanced Propulsion Centre is like the front door to the Automotive Transformation Fund. So what we do is we talk to those people interested in investing. We run the feasibility studies and the scale-up readiness and things like that. And we support people in that initial application phase for the fund. And with people like British Volt, we saw an ambitious startup that wanted to, be a founding bedrock of the British battery industry. So we gave them a lot of support, as we would anybody in that space, and we support Alan's company as well. And we do that from the point of view of helping them to get into the Automotive Transformation Fund, but also working with other other elements of government to help them find the right piece of land or connect with the right energy suppliers or whatever it might be.
The committee recently had a visit to Sweden. I can't disclose who said it, but when we were there, someone said to us, the co-founder of British Volt, Mr. Karlström, he doesn't know what he's doing. You should have called us and we would have told you. And of course, he was convicted for tax fraud and had to stand down. And the assessment from the people we spoke to in Sweden was that he was not one of the few people in Europe that actually know how to make batteries. He was somebody that just thought he could kind of bring the supply chain together and make it work in a warehouse up north. Surely it's your job to do due diligence on the individuals running these businesses before you kind of set all of the support in place. Did you do that on Mr. Karlström or not?
Before there's any serious investment in these things, there is a level of due diligence, but equally we start a discussion with people around and as you know, he stepped out quite early in the story. So yes, we do a level of due diligence, but at that early stage, we're interested in people's ideas, we're interested in their credibility around their ideas, and what British Volt did. You're quite right. What British Volt did was they had an idea, and they weren't experts in battery making, but what they managed to do was pull a very credible expert team of UK scientists and business people in, and that's why over then the period of the next 12 to 18 months, that business did actually make some significant headway. It was disappointing that it didn't make it all the way there.
Do you think that process of whether people are fit and proper people or qualified people to run these businesses needs to be changed? So in this committee, we've seen examples before where there have been individuals who are good communicators and sell a strong story to a government body or supported body and get quite far down the track with support, whether it's financial or otherwise, and then they blow up and it turns out they don't know what they're doing. I mean, we were told when we were in Stockholm that Mr. Karlström came to the UK because he wasn't allowed to set up a business in Sweden because he wasn't deemed to be credible. I'm just trying to understand, do you think the process needs to change so we can avoid raising everyone's expectations in the way that we did with British Volt again?
I think that he didn't stay with the company for very long. He was in at the very early stages and he went. So, I mean,
the leadership of a company is important, isn't it, in terms of
it is, yes.
How you're signing off investment or support. So my question, which I don't think you quite answered, was the process that's in place for assessing the credibility of the leadership of a company that wants access to government support, be it money or otherwise. Is that process robust enough, or does it need to change?
I think the process is reasonably robust. I think it is robust. I think it might be a question of when we apply those tests.
Andy, you want to?
Just following on from that, I mean, that Swedish trip was quite informing. I came away from thinking, well, the reason British Volt didn't work was because it didn't have a product, it didn't have a customer. And there was no vertical integration present. It's the very thing we've been talking about this afternoon. And that is that a fair analysis? No product, no customer?
I don't think it is fair from my point of view. I think that, as I said, they had a very credible group of scientific and business people, UK-based, who were developing what was a very strong product. We saw some of the initial outcome of that product development through the UK Battery Industrialisation Centre, and it was very good. And they had some, or my understanding at least, was that they had some very strong interest from some very credible OEMs. Now, the issue here is, and we're talking about, this valley of death issue about scaling businesses up. Once you get past that initial investment, those seed rounds and that early phase, into that scale-up phase, and that's a particular issue with hard tech, but particularly automotive, because you fall into, again, this another chicken and egg situation where in order to get an off-take agreement from an OEM, you've got to demonstrate you've got the wherewithal to build a factory at volume. You have to then say to your investors, can I have the money to build my factory at volume? And they will say to you, I haven't got your off-take agreement from your OEM. So you're caught in this constant cycle. And that's kind of the bit that I think we really need to focus on how we solve. And I think that's a question of investors, government and industry working together and putting their heads together, because that's the biggest problem I see in developing businesses like Britishvolt and getting this UK technology out into a place where we industrialise it and actually, the country does well out of it.
I want to continue this further, but isn't that exactly what happened with Northvolt, to be able to have those things in place, to have the customer, and that's what they actually pulled off.
Northvolt did really well because they had European Investment Bank money and they bought the OEM in terms of Volkswagen and Volvo, and they managed to create that environment, and that magic didn't happen with Britishvolt.
Thank you. And did I see you wanted to say something or not?
Yes, it's a point a little bit at a tangent. I think we run the risk of being very pessimistic again about the UK battery industry. I think we should be very positive about it. We've got a huge amount of opportunity ahead of us. I think we should learn from what's worked well in the past and what's not worked well in the past, but we should use it as a learning exercise and not let it shape too much the future. We need a UK battery industry. We've got the technology as a UK business, we've got the passion, we just need, and we've got the plans and the capability, we just need government support to make it happen.
Heard loud and clear. Ian, I think you wanted to come
Just
in.
a very brief question to get back to the Auto Transformation Fund. How critical is it for a company like Britishvolt to have a commitment, whether it's 100 million, whether it's 200 million, whether it's 300 million, from the government to attract private investment?
Absolutely, 100%.
Yeah, it is. It's as the industrialist on the panel, it's vital. It's vital because that's the corner.
Sorry, it's vital that.
It's vital to have the government support and the government backing to attract the investors in, because nobody really wants to go first. When you're talking about this level of investment.
Because my understanding was with Britishvolt is that the government were quizzing them and probing them about private investment, and if they could achieve some private investment and prove that was the case, then that would have been basically a tick box exercise to get money from the Auto Transformation Fund, and Britishvolt was saying something completely different, the opposite, and it cannot be both, you see. It cannot be both. So from what you've said, you've answered the question that it's critical to encourage private investment from global investment, really.
The Automotive Transformation Fund did commit money, but it was based on, as you say, so that commitment was there, provided they could get the investment from the market.
Thanks. We'll come back to all of this, I suspect, in future sessions, but we've timed out for today, so thank you to all three of you for your contributions. We'll bring the session to an end. Order.
Yes, thank you very much. That was very helpful.
Thank you.